The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everyone. ARAPA is pleased to present this Lunch and Learn program. Please note that today's call is being recorded. All participant lines are muted during this broadcast. Today's presentation will last 60 minutes and includes specific question and answer periods. However, you can queue up a question for us at any time during today's presentation. To ask a question, simply type it in the chat box area on the lower right side of your screen and click on Send. This Lunch and Learn is entitled Developing Mold Literacy, Lessons Learned from the Mold Crisis on Campus. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Christine Messina. Christine, the audience is yours.
Well, thank you, Billy and ARAPA, and to each of you joining us on the call today. I appreciate you sharing your valuable time. It is your most precious resource, and I do pledge to use it responsibly. Now, if I had an alternate title for today's program, Developing Mold Literacy, it would simply be this. What do you know about mold that you need everyone else to know? Literacy is, of course, defined as competence or knowledge in a specified area. My question to you is, who else do you consider to be mold literate? And I will follow that up with the $64,000 question. Is there a benefit to you to promote increased mold literacy across departments, faculty, students, and families? Now, you have heard a lot about the symptoms that mold can cause, and you may be the first to agree that yes, mold can cause headaches. And for the public institutions on this call, I want you to know I was concerned about getting a bargain, so I've purchased the value size. For those of you who might have agita, as my Italian grandmother would say, I've got the ultra strength because we know that 2018 was a particularly potent year for mold, contributing to situations that looked like this. Now, the good news of this slide, and yes, this is good news, this is not the cause or the type of mold that you've been dealing with in your facilities. This is an extreme case due to neglect. This particular property was in the midst of a real estate transaction when the roof blew off. So unmitigated water and humidity built up into the building without it being dried down or addressed properly. However, in the public's mind, when you say the word mold, is it possible that they leap in their minds to an image like this? In 2018, without a doubt, the record rainfall contributed to exacerbated conditions that contributed to mold. We're looking at a slide that is highlighting Washington, D.C., but for those of you in and around the area, you likely saw record-breaking rainfall as well. Combine that with the excessive heat that coincides with August's move-in timing, and it's easy to see how we're starting to gather the perfect storm factors that lead to headlines like the one in the lower right-hand corner. But is there something else to it in 2018? If you would agree that mold is just as much managing a people issue as it is a building issue, is it possible that cultural shifts like the weather have an impact on the intensity of how you are handling this mold challenge? For sure, we live in an instant gratification culture, and the margins for the immediacy of that gratification are narrowing every year. Now we can swipe our screen and have an Amazon package delivered to our door in 24 hours. Also, we are in the information age. Some of us have arrived into it in our careers, but we know we're serving consumers that were born into it. So because we can share information and it will travel quickly because of the technology that we have, it doesn't mean that we've got a quality control monitor in place. So much so that dictionary.com named its word of the year, misinformation. Now, something that I think a lot of you will find interesting and will certainly resonate with some of the experiences that you're having. Euromonitor is a global market research firm that tracks trends to better inform businesses about how they can connect with consumers and how it impacts their way of doing business. Euromonitor named its 2018 Trend of the Year call-out culture. That is to say that individuals find it socially acceptable to complain publicly online about a person, place, or event. And that commonplace practice of complaining publicly leads us into the 4 stages of a mold event. In the first stage, we have our initial discoveries. Maybe it's one area and then another. And as clusters develop, I call this the whack-a-mole phase, we may decide to bring in an outside consultant. The outside consultant will take some time to do their walkthroughs, perform their inspections, investigations, and interviews, and after collecting enough data, presenting it to you, will make the difficult decision to close off some areas or potentially relocate students. This is when the communication from the institution starts to initiate and really ratchet up, because now you have to write the communication that says that the occupant's routine is going to be disrupted because we have a problem. This then leads into the social media frenzy where folks are complaining online, adding their own hashtags, talking about their inconvenience, questioning the competency of the institution, and the media descends upon the campus. The remediation takes place, things go back to normal, and then it's incumbent upon the institution to make declarations and vow to do better, vow to be more proactive. So all this communication in phases 2 through 4 is happening parallel to the event. What this has taught us is the importance of doing preventive maintenance on communication. Communication is a tool in the battle against mold. So it's really important to front load that communication before events of any size, and to do so with awareness, teamwork, and training. From an operational perspective, the big takeaway, and I know this resonates with a lot of you, is the importance of getting ahead of those extreme weather patterns, the excessive humidity, so that we've got dehumidification contingencies in place. So how can we translate this into an actionable program to help us develop mold literacy to fill that gap? We're going to first take a look at how we can be a resource in advance, how we can learn these benefits so that we're better at detecting mold and preventing issues from occurring, putting the brakes on it before small issues become bigger. Then we'll take a look at what components should be included in your mold management plan and how it can serve as a compass to navigate your team and procedures. Then we'll move into the third section, and emphasis will be placed on transferring that important knowledge, not only to your staff, but also to occupants and especially residents. Finally, we'll get specific in the fourth section about placing our focus on patterns of increased risk of mold growth that coincide with the heat of first semester and the vacancies of semester break. So let's dive into the first section. If we want to be successful in gaining control of this issue, we have to be more aggressive in communicating about it. We've all heard the adage and guidance, mold control is moisture control. What today's discussion will do is challenge that and say, that's just not enough to win the day. Mold control is accurate information control. This is a topic that fades in and out of the public's consciousness. And some of you may have been on the other end of that emergency phone call when your administration asks you to hand over the TP, the talking points. They will ask, what can we say about what mold is? How do we handle it? How will we prevent this from happening in the future? The point is, all of that good information, all of that knowledge that you have can and should be shared all year long. It becomes compromised when you're delivering it in a reactionary context. This is the difference between when an organization says that they are transparent in the midst of a crisis versus having that proactive posture of being visible about your prevention all year long. So why does mold get to enjoy such a negative high profile on a topic that we are the experts on? Here's the deal. If we gave mold a personality, we would quickly size up. It is not fighting fair. To date, the media has had a decades-long lead on driving the narrative on this topic with almost no competition. Mold enjoys the support of bigger and better resources, the full backing of media outlets to include your school's own newspaper. It gets to tell its horror story of invasions and health threats nearly unchallenged and on repeat. As a result, mold has cemented a place in the public's mind in a manner that is synonymous with negativity and hysteria. It's time that we take the necessary steps to use our voice to develop our own narrative and get ahead. The importance of auditing your published mold communications is to make enough of the right noise so we're not shouted down unarmed at the wrong time. So you've got lots of assets available to you. You've got your institution's website, and you have a way to publish the facts, separate the mold facts from the mold fears, to include frequently asked questions. And I understand, I get it. Your students aren't reading your website as a course of their daily habits, but you do have a way to take that content and push it out through text or perhaps some of the social accounts of your institution that could be made available to you. So with so much misinformation and ulterior motives out there, how can you avoid the Dr. Google syndrome and continued spread of inaccuracies? Here's where you're going to have to hold your constituents' hands a bit and frame the difference between credible sources or a Facebook thread that's been shared 18,386 times. So those credible resources are the EPA, the Centers for Disease Control, the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and your state's Department of Health. That is where you're going to be sourcing your content on the facts and FAQs. Now, if I had a top 10 of facts, pieces of content that I question if people know are true or false, here they are. Number 10, mold exists outdoors and indoors. Zero spores should not be the goal, and living spaces are not sterile environments unless you're in a hospital or a research lab. Presented as a true or false question, I wonder how many people in your community, if you ask them, are they breathing mold in right now, they may or may not get that question correct. Of course we're breathing mold in. We have microscopic spores that are in the air right now. Number 9, mold issues indoors can occur in degrees of severity. Many times, all that is required is a thorough cleaning with a mild detergent and drying. This is the opposite of what people tend to think when they hear the word mold. They tend to immediately picture something that is much more invasive and threatening. And to that tune, here's a pet peeve of mine. Toxic mold is a term that is not supported by the CDC. This is a really important fact and FAQ that could be answered by sourcing their content. Are there health concerns? Absolutely. No one on this call is denying that. But we have to take the words toxic mold out of the mainstream. Number 7, not all mold that is dark in color or is black mold or Stachybotrys. I wonder how many times some of you have received the call from an occupant who says, I have something on my walls, I have black mold. We don't know if that is the case until we conduct an investigation. And furthermore, all of this emphasis on black mold has me concerned because looking for white mold is important. We know that mold in its early growth stages looks like a white, powdery, fine dust. And sometimes it is so uniform that we're not going to see it without the illumination of a flashlight, as you're seeing in these 2 images. And we're going to talk about that a bit later when we get to training. All molds, to include Stachybotrys, are remediated the same. This is important, again, because sometimes an individual's conception or what they think they know about mold is that some are more dangerous than others, and we could get into that detail at another time. But the point is, the efficacy in remediation is in the removal of the spores. So it doesn't matter the species. The efficacy is in the thorough removal no matter what it is. Number 5 and 4 go hand in hand. There are no laws established at the federal state level, and there are no established standards or threshold limit values for airborne mold because mold is an allergen. so many people don't understand that this is what creates a lot of the gray area, and why relying on the judgment of very sound partners and the knowledge within your institution is so important. Number 3, reaction to mold is on an individual basis and ranges from no reaction, you don't hear that publicized very often, to allergy-like symptoms to, in rare cases of immune-compromised, more serious illness. So I took a little creative license here. I wouldn't call this a fact. I would call this opinion, but maybe it's an opinion shared by many of you. The media's investigative tone promotes an us versus them adversarial dynamic, amplifying fear and undermining trust. And because I'm talking about laying a foundation within your platforms to address this issue, I want to share with you a great example of how one of your institutions is introducing this topic on their environmental health and safety page. So I'd like to thank Paul Muldoon, who provided me with the permission to use this slide. Mold is a simple plant-like organism that exists everywhere. There is a great deal of information available about mold, but much of it wrong or designed to alarm people unnecessarily. That is really striking the perfect tone. And this is kind of like using the force, right? The media gets to have its moment in striking that emotional chord. The way it's being framed here is very responsible. It's speaking to what the mindset is right now and giving people another way to think about this topic. Very well done. And number 1, the grand enchilada, as I like to say. No HVAC system was designed to address the excessive and sustained levels of humidity fueled by the record rains and heat of 2018. This is a challenge that should no longer be a best-kept secret. We saw this hiccup over and over again. So armed with that information, it's very important that we place a focus on supplementing with dehumidification. This is going to be essential for many reasons, but certainly if we have a weather pattern that repeats itself from 2018 into 2019. So when the HVAC system can't keep pace, whether there is a mechanical issue or something that you're troubleshooting, or it's just been pushed to its limits because it's August and it's the 10th day of being 95 degrees with 90% absolute humidity outside, whatever the situation, you have to have a way to know the weather inside your building, and you have to be empowered to control the indoor climate. So we know that ideally we want relative humidity at 30 to 50%. As it's creeping past 50% and nearing 60%, now we know we're getting towards the danger zone. That's when the air will create an equilibrium where we've got vapor that's forming in the form of condensation, or on surfaces, you're starting to begin to get that slick feeling. Also, very important, we talk about mold control being moisture control, but we control moisture by adding it into our buildings for good intentions, to do moisture generating cleaning activities such as stripping and waxing floors, shampooing and extracting carpets, even painting. Paint is a water-based product, so putting all of that water-based product into the environment is increasing the moisture. So it's okay to do those things as long as they're being strategically scheduled in concert with dehumidification, why the activities are taking place, and I would say even a day afterwards. All right, moving into our second session, your mold management plan. Mold management is a team sport, and I do hope you will enlist more people. Your mold management plan is your playbook. So I've got some components listed here that should be included in your plan. First and foremost, the purpose and rationale. And what you want to make sure that you include here is the common nature of this building condition and your preparedness for it and your competency in it. To say that if you're in the business of managing buildings, you are in the business of managing mold. So that's something that should really just be addressed up front. And then, because we typically have such a big focus on water and water intrusion, it's really important in the rationale for people to understand the emphasis and the importance of the role that humidity plays. You're also going to include responsibilities by stakeholder. This is where you'll have a workflow demonstrating that when a complaint comes in, how does it travel throughout your departments? What are the decision points for it to escalate into testing? And it's really important, we'll talk about this a little bit later, that you've got system for documenting your work order documentation. Of course, you're going to include your procedures for prevention, and right along with that, reporting conditions that make it hospitable for mold to grow. This is where, again, we want to use language like condensation, noticing sweating pipes, elevated levels of relative humidity, and of course, what the response and remediation procedures look like. Getting to testing, I know this is a thorn in your side. Maybe it's a Game of Thrones daggers size thorn. The conundrum of testing is that it can be something that people want immediately as soon as they have a complaint. So in your program, you want to be able to explain how an investigation is conducted and the importance of taking a more holistic picture, taking in those interviews, taking in data from the weather. I think everyone on this call knows that testing is something that once you've got the data, you have to live with it, but not everyone has the knowledge to interpret it. And again, that's something that we can speak to later. Repeating those facts and FAQs, what are the health concerns, and making sure that you're noting, again, you're using the best guidance as given by the EPA and some other governing bodies, but that there are no laws or acceptable levels of airborne exposure. Education for employees and education for students. This is a part of your prevention that should be included in your plan. We're going to break those out in a future section. And of course, a rationale for revisions. This should be a living document, so prove that it is when all eyes are on this topic right now. Take it out, have that reading around the table, make the edits that are necessary, and note it with a date and time log. Now, within your plan, you all are acing mold prevention protocols when there is an active water leak, and we're looking at a chiller break right here. When something like this happens in your institution, no one is questioning what their next steps are. They're reacting with immediacy. They know they have to address it, extract the water, dry the building down immediately, or else mold can grow. The connection between active water, mold awareness, and mold prevention is all baked in, and everyone here is doing a really great job of that. The question is, can we make it more routinized for some of the less obvious contributing factors to be addressed with the same level of immediacy and awareness? So those issues being excessive high humidity, relative humidity that's creeping beyond 60%, condensation, sweating pipes, cold surfaces. Can you train your staff to make those conditions reported so that we can say, let's get a handle on why this is happening, or else mold can potentially grow? Moving into the next session, training for your staff and occupants. This is where we'll pick up on some of the training that's mentioned in your mold management plan. Your staff are your returning players. Your new recruits are maybe some staff or departments you haven't thought about inviting in previously. So perhaps it's residence life, perhaps it's the resident advisors, other faculty, and of course the student residents themselves. This is a very simple mini campaign to raise awareness and to build some trust in your institution. I think one of the unfortunate things about managing mold or mold complaints is sometimes from the get-go, there's a sense of skepticism or mistrust. When you invite everyone in to see something, smell something, say something, now we're all a part of the same team. In the upper right-hand corner, we're even doing a little bit of awareness education about the identification of mold, because I think in its early growth stage, it does suffer from a case of misidentification. People think that they're looking for something black, green, dark, colonized on a ceiling tile, of course, those are issues as well, but they're quite visible after the fact. What we want people to know is that mold in its early growth stages looks white and powdery, can be mistaken for dust, and is on surfaces underneath contents, under desks, under drawers, in between cabinetry. And again, that using that illumination is going to be really key in making sure that we can see it. So, training your staff on those 360-degree inspections is going to be a really important game changer. We see people tripping over this over and over again. You're going to be using tools like your temperature and humidity monitors and moisture meters, but that flashlight is going to be key when you're going into a room and inspecting all areas. Encouraging a checklist where you're going into a closet, you're using that flashlight to illuminate, you're looking underneath surfaces because we know that dark areas are hospitable for mold growth. Also in the training, you want to make sure that if you've made a threshold, whether it's the EPA's under 10 square feet, that remediation can be performed in-house, or perhaps you're in an institution where you've trained for more square footage, that in-house staff can do under 30 square feet, or whatever that break is. Just make sure that you are consistent, you are training for it, and you are providing the proper PPE. For those minor cleanups, the minimal PPE is just fine. Gloves, unvented goggles, and an N95 mask. Keeping the fundamentals refreshed, that those rags that are used for the cleaning and the removal of those spores are going into a plastic bag, gooseneck tied and duct taped so that when they exit the building, they're not cross-contaminating and spreading spores as they travel. And the use of a mild detergent versus bleach. I'm not sure if this is something that you're still running into. In our course of remediations, as long as the mold is derived from clean water like humidity amplified mold would be, it is perfectly fine to use a mild detergent. We use Dawn. I understand that some folks might want to use something stronger, but really a biocide like a microban or a shockwave should be used when when the mold source has been contaminated or began growth from a contaminated source like sewage or flood water. Another really important area for training for your staff, remember, they are the front line. Mold's a high touch issue. So the person that is coming to that academic space, coming to that dorm room and is encountering the person who has the complaint really needs the proper training, and everything from good listening to customer service, having a few scripted points when they get tough questions like, are you going to test? Also, thorough documentation at this point in time is really important. You want to document what corrective actions are taken, what were the readings when you were there, what was the weather like outside. And another #1 complaint area that we hear over and over again is response time. So that when an issue comes through your work order system, fix it, whatever that you're using, if there is a delay in time beyond 24 hours, if someone says they have a mold complaint or an IAQ complaint, you have to decide what that time frame is. I think right now, with this being on everyone's radar, it's important to say that you're going to get there within 24 hours. So you may need a flag system or some type of urgency to notate that work order so that it's followed through properly and make sure that it's closed out or that progress reports are given. Again, for those of you who've been through this, this tends to be a spot where people complain about the process. So making sure your staff has the proper tools. I've mentioned the flashlight a few times. Of course, moisture meters are stock and trade of what we use. I'm sure that you do too. To demonstrate, again, with more imagery, I think this really helps to drive home for staff the importance of having a flashlight in inspections. On the left-hand side, you see a bookcase that to the naked eye looks perfectly fine. On the right-hand side, it's not until that high-powered beam is illuminating that area that we can now see that there's the early growth stages of mold. I mentioned closets earlier. How easy is it for us to not open that closet door, or to open it and, you know, it appears fine, but we have to remember and raise awareness to the staff that a closet is mold's favorite home. It is the Ritz-Carlton. It's got all the ideal conditions. It's dark. It's not well ventilated. Sometimes it's holding wet contents. The custodial closets in particular, and we see this a lot in institutions, it's got a water source, it's got wet contents, so those areas do require extra surveillance. More of the tools that you may have on hand but may want to consider increasing. Here's a quick of Murphy's Law. This particular institution had athletic storage in the basement. We know that basements are particularly vulnerable. They're already at risk. To the facility management's credit, they knew that as well. They had the proper equipment in place to be checking relative humidity. Unfortunately, whether it was miscalibrated or malfunctioned, it was not reading that that area was going beyond 60% relative humidity, but what became visible was surface mold on this duffel bag. And if you think about a day in the life of this duffel bag, it all makes great sense. And again, this is all good education to pass on to staff and to residents. That duffel bag is probably going outdoors. It might be on an athletic field. It might be on the quad. It's picking up spores from the ground. And then what goes into that bag? Wet contents, athletic equipment, maybe a wet jersey. Then that bag goes into a closet or it goes onto a shelf without a lot of ventilation. We're not picking up on the excessive humidity, and now we've got all the puzzle pieces in place for that surface mold to grow. And here's our handheld device showing that that area was unfortunately beyond 60% relative humidity. More equipment in the battle against mold and diagnosing water intrusion. Hopefully, many of you have heavier duty thermal imaging cameras. If you're thinking about increasing that equipment for your staff, there is a way to do that at a friendlier price point. Now we can turn our cell phones, our smartphones into thermal imaging equipment. FLIR One puts out a great product. It's a piece of hardware that will attach either to Android or iPhone. You download the app, and then your screen can be used as a thermal imaging device. Moving on to training the residents, your new recruits. Here's an image, happy image, typical move-in day in August. I'm sure it is the hottest 1, 2, 3 days of the year. Look at these fresh faces. They're so excited. They've just come from Bed Bath & Beyond. They've exhausted all their big blue coupons. And what are they doing? They're bringing in a lot of contents. Here's the typical dorm room. Right now, you've got the closets open. It's able to ventilate because it's got no contents. We know that this is not how people live once they move in. Reality looks closer to something like this or like this. So when I see this, and what we all see is what we need the occupants to see, I see so many opportunities for mold to grow. Let's start with the window. If there's condensation, it's going to get trapped on these curtains. There's no air moving in between this bed that's been shoved up against the wall. I know we tend to encourage under the bed storage. I don't know that that's the best idea because, again, we're blocking off ventilation. I will say a positive is that this desk isn't abutting the bed, but it could be pulled back away from the wall a bit. Carpeting is really difficult. It requires a lot of shampooing and extracting. If these contents are wet and is seeping into the carpet, now we're creating another vapor barrier. So I see lots of problematic issues with this if we're not educating students about what they can do to prevent mold. So we're going to talk about what the 3 C's are in a minute. As I said, some of the things that I just pointed out to you could be pointed out to them in the form of literature, awareness campaigns, the information that is talked about in their orientation and their first resident advisor floor meetings. It's also really important when you're communicating with students that you're taking credit for the routine prevention you are already doing. cleaning, dust reduction, using HEPA vacs in your cleaning, minor work orders, responding to water incidents with immediacy and drying down. This is what you do. That is how you prevent mold all year long. Getting back to a simple protocol for students, the 3 C's is something that some institutions are using: cleanliness, climate control, and communication. Now, I know you're not hearing it from me first, that these kids are arriving to school and maybe they didn't learn to clean at home. But this is a new era of responsibility and independence, and they are, in some ways, both the tenant and the property manager of that dorm room. So emphasizing that cleanliness is a key activity and mold prevention is important. Climate control speaks to, I know dorms are configured differently, but if that student is able to control the temperature in the room, that you've got clear signage about what those controls should be by the season, and not ratcheting the air conditioning down so low during the summer that when the exterior walls are hot that you're creating that condensation on the window. And then this is really ultra important: communication. When they do see conditions that are of concern, or maybe they see something that is visible, or they have a question, that concern is communicated to your fix-it order or work order program, the appropriate person and department. In other words, we don't want them filing a work order on Instagram. That is not your work order system, or going to the Twitterverse with their complaint. So I think a way to develop that relationship, if there's any opportunity, again, in those initial weeks when they are taking in a lot of information, they are gathering for orientation purposes, is it possible for somebody from the facility staff or the maintenance team to be a part of those meetings, put a face to it, and explain the importance of all these issues that we're talking about and how they are to report their concerns? A little more emphasis, because there has been so much emphasis on humidity amplified surface mold. So let's get to where the rubber meets the road. Let's talk about the surfaces that are in those dorm rooms. Perhaps a little protocol and awareness, like simplify, keep them dry, let it sigh. I know it's a little bit corny, but breathe wasn't going to rhyme, is a reminder to, if at all possible, particularly in the first semester, when you don't have to have all the clothes for all the seasons, to simplify the contents that you're bringing in, because we want to be able to, as much as we can, conserve some square footage and have the ability for air to flow around the contents. Keep them dry is obvious, whether it's towels, laundry, athletic equipment, whatever it is, to not let wet contents accumulate and gather together, to give them a chance to dry before you're storing items away in a closet. And let those contents breathe. Pull the desk away from the wall, all those things that we talked about when we looked at that dorm room. A very low-tech option for dehumidification, and this might be a great response to the difficulty of closets or cramped storage, something like just a silica-based product that will pull moisture out of the air. You see folks use these in campers, boats, that type of thing, basements. So I could see where this would have a really easy dorm room application for the concerns that we have about, we talked about the rain. It's a fact of life. If you've been walking across the quad and you've got on a raincoat and your wet backpack and your boots and your jeans have gotten wet, obviously that's a reality of life, but this might be an alternative to being able to address it more quickly. All right, finally, our fourth piece of the program here, enhancing your break protocols. Let's not be surprised. Mold has a witching hour and you can neutralize it. Now that we're increasing awareness and vigilance about reporting high humidity and condensation, we have the ability to get ahead of that perfect storm. So review your mold management plan. How does it align with your current situation? How does it align with recent patterns, recent events? How will it align with the summer and those peak periods of heat and rain? Identify the resources that you need. We don't like to think about a worst case scenario, but it's incumbent upon us to think about an all hazards plan. So if you've not met with your risk management and finance department yet, it would be a good idea to talk about, again, we don't want to get to this place, but in the spirit of preparedness, if you had to do a relocation plan, logistically, what does that look like and what are the resources necessary? This next portion, I think this is a step that many of you are already taking. You need to categorize and prioritize by building what facilities need permanent repairs, which ones need short-term repairs, and which ones will perform well enough in average seasonal temperatures, but when pushed to its limits, will need that Band-Aid of dehumidification. So as we said, this is getting to the witching hour. We're getting into the warmer temperatures right now. We're thinking about how can we do August through October better than we did last year. Is it possible that we have to think about how can we conduct daily inspections? Once folks move in, that becomes a bit harder, but is there a workaround? Is there a role for the resident advisor to play if they're trained on using a temp and humidity monitor? Can they be taking those readings on a daily basis when we still have seasonal concerns? What manpower is required? Do we need volunteers to cover all of the square footage that's been added to your grounds? Can we use checklists to support the thoroughness of that 360-degree inspection? It's not enough to just say it, but can we put something in the hands of your staff so they're more accountable to the thoroughness of the inspections, cleanings, using those flashlights? And what tools will you need? We just talked about some of them, but will you need to procure more? So along with summer break, we know that breaks in general are vulnerabilities. Sometimes folks come back after a winter break and they're making discoveries and letting you know of their concerns. A couple of key tenets here, I would say, number one, always favor climate control over energy efficiency. If someone's convincing you that you are going to save money by lowering the ventilation, I would bring to them several invoices for remediation that would say otherwise. Also, we could not have a discussion about mold without focusing on HVAC maintenance. That, of course, was not the focus or the skew of today's program. But without a doubt, it's really important. If you have not worked with a NADCA certified duct cleaner in some time, take a look at your logs. Find out when of the last times those activities were performed. They've got great equipment, robotics, and cameras that can bring a lot of great data back to you when you want to be extra vigilant about your inspections. Signage for climate control, reminders in closets. Sometimes we have to make the connection and make it obvious. And it's okay to say, we ask that you keep the temperature at these settings because we're all concerned about indoor air quality and we know that this is a good method to prevent mold growth. We mentioned earlier that it's important to make sure that with your water generating maintenance activities that you're using dehumidification. Sometimes breaks are a time when we're trying to get those extra things done. So just remember, again, in the spirit of doing things with good intentions, that water that you're using can have its consequences and to make sure to add that dehumidification. So remember, there's a big difference between claiming transparency once an event has captured the public's attention versus you gaining the public's attention when there's no event, demonstrating how you are making mold education, prevention, and communication visible on campus all year long. So in summary, take a look at your mold communication coverage. This is different than your mold insurance coverage. That's a whole other seminar. But you have these assets available to you. It may just be a matter of looking at them in a different way, refreshing them, and leveraging them more. Operations folks like yourselves are not used to taking credit for the job that you do. With a get it done mentality, you're on to the next. But it's really important to let people know the good things that you're doing all year long. So using your mold management plan as an anchor and feeding everything else off to that, you've got plenty of platform available to you in your website. It's just a matter of maybe asking for a little airspace and airtime to push out some positive messaging and to push out those conditions that you want folks to report and tips to prevent mold. And then, of course, education is a really big piece of the prevention puzzle here. So refreshing the training for facilities and housing folks, but also maybe new to your program, maybe you've not yet considered or entertained the idea of how you can bring in students and faculty into that education for prevention as well. So in summary, increasing mold literacy is a worthy goal. It benefits you and everyone in the community. Unfortunately, higher ed institutions have had to pay a higher cost in scope and reputational damage. And the biggest lesson learned was the importance of communicating and educating in an ongoing and proactive manner. We also know, and I will shout it from the mountaintops on your behalf, HVAC systems are not designed to remove excessive humidity, and temporary contingencies needed to be established and enacted until permanent replacement. Applying the proactive communication strategies utilized by those who have weathered a crisis, your institution can become a visible resource to promote mold literacy all year long. Billy, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right.
We're going to give Christine just a minute or two break here, and we're going to do a couple of polls. So I'm going to open a poll now, and if you would take just a few seconds to answer this, I would appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to close this one, and we're going to go on to our second question. Okay, we're going to close and go to our third. Okay, we're going to go and one final question. Okay, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to do this. Now let's begin the question and answer segment of the presentation. Your participation adds great value to all attendees, so please don't be afraid to send in questions for your presenters. To enter a question through the web conference system, simply type your question in the box in the lower right corner of your screen and make sure to click on Submit to submit your button. So we have some questions in our queue. So our first question of the day is, what would a good AC temp be in a student room? 68 to 70 degrees?
I would say yes. You know, of course, I want to rely on the experts that are at your institution, but that's safe.
Okay. Next question. In an unoccupied room with classic fan coil units, is it better to run the AC on low or off if we are still providing ventilation to the space? Cold surfaces cause condensation. Warmer air carries more moisture. Catch 22.
Yeah, it certainly is a catch-22, and it's a catch-22 for myself as well. I want to make sure that I provide, especially the person who took the time to type the question, the most accurate answer. I would, if I may, Billy, respond to that by email. I would check with an HVAC specialist that we work with.
Okay, great. My next question is, have you encountered the use of store-bought mold testing kits? What are your thoughts on that?
I wonder how many people on this call have encountered the use of store-bought testing kits. My thought on that is that they're a bunch of bunk. So unfortunately, these products are made available. Folks can order them on Amazon. We know that Occupants are doing this. We see it in several markets. The issue is that if you think about it, what those kits prove is that if you put out a buffet for mold to grow, you provide a hospitable environment, you are able to, it proves that you can make mold. It doesn't prove that there's mold in the air or that there's a problem.
Okay.
So we don't acknowledge the use of them.
Okay. In your experience, what is the best resource for a step-by-step basement wall floor cleanup of concrete?
So I'm assuming that it's surface mold. We'll go with that. So you want to stick with the EPA guidelines. So first, I would say if this person is asking if they can conduct it in-house, I would be concerned about the amount of square footage and if the staff has the proper training. But going back to the EPA guidelines, the breaks. As long as you're able to determine that it is from a clean water source, again, you're going to use a mild detergent. HEPA vac first so that any of the spores that are on the surface are being taken out, out of the air off the surface. Wipe, use a mild detergent, clean, dry, HEPA vac again. And then if you have equipment available to you, if you're reading that there's excessive humidity in the room, of course you want to include a dehumidifier and some air movement, some fans.
Okay, thank you. How would you address situations with wet basements where water infiltration occurs on a regular basis?
Wet basements are such a common occurrence. So you have to get to the source. Whether you're able to do that with your in-house professionals or if you need to, seek the services, from an outside contractor, but getting to the source is really important. What we see that is typical is that, any changes in the grading, so perhaps some landscaping has taken place, maybe the weather has shifted some things around, roots are moving around. You want to make sure that you're directing water away from the building. I will say with all those great efforts, I'm going to go back to the extremity that was 2018. People who had never had wet basements before had wet basements last year. The water table was just that high. So as you're trying to get to the source and correct the source, I would strongly recommend in the meantime to protect yourself to have dehumidification down there so that you're taking moisture out of the air.
Next question. What is the best way to share test results with building occupants?
Wow, this is a great question. And I said that testing is a catch-22 and a conundrum. So obviously everything is on a case-by-case basis, but I think, the best way to go is, especially for folks who are in public institutions when everything's a public record, there's nothing to hide, right? I think that the key piece in our hesitation in sharing information is that people don't know how to interpret it. So I would say as long as it's good to share the results because you want to prove that you have nothing to hide. You're an open book. I would just say make sure you've got the proper staff person, the proper speaker to those test results who can put them into context because, I'll use a very simple example. If we were to test in an area that was an area of concern, test somewhere else in the building that is not an affected area and test outside. And I'll make up counts. We'll say the area that's, of concern is 500 for Aspergillus penicillin. In another area, it's 300. And outside, it says 0. Someone looking at that just on paper, without context, without having the voiceover of an educated professional would say, we've got elevated levels indoors compared with outdoors, when in fact, those are acceptable levels. And what is happening outdoors, if it says 0, that means it rained the day that we tested. So having that educated voice who can voice it over and put the results into context when you're sharing it with building occupants is essential.
Okay. Do you recommend pre and post testing or just post testing?
Again, something that comes up all of the time. I would say generally, the belief is that if there's visible mold that you don't need to test, right? You see all the time that we don't want to put expenses against something when we know that we need to handle it. The reason that my firm as a contractor typically is working in a situation where there's pre and post testing is for liability purposes. And again, this is where people need to understand the context of testing. If that was not an issue, you could save money on that pre-testing, but testing is used typically, of course, sometimes to understand the extent of a situation, is it airborne or not? But really it is most often used as a point of protecting the liability of the folks working in the situation, and sometimes to justify remediation costs.
Okay. What is the best proactive approach to diffuse mold growth?
The best proactive approach is to be ultra vigilant about the conditions that can produce mold growth. So we have to remember the mold is a constant, the food in our building is a constant, and the temperature is a constant. As I said, I think everyone's really good about keeping water out of the building. That's top of mind, but it's really about controlling the indoor environment. So the best prevention is knowing that in your indoor environment, you don't have elevated moisture levels so that you always know the relative humidity of your spaces.
Thank you. What about a classroom that has CO2 sensors and due to the high CO2 levels, the BAS opens the outside air dampers to bring in outside air to exchange the room air during hot, humid days?
Yeah, I don't recommend that. Again, to make sure that I give the most accurate information, I'm happy to provide that with a little more detail in an email. But I can see, it's correcting one or the other. So that's something that I would appreciate if I could have the opportunity to add a little more commentary to that over an email.
I'll make sure you get the gentleman's email address. One more
Absolutely.
question. You need to do pre-tests to determine types of mold present.
So there's two things happening. We said that, in the program that we're not going to remediate any differently. We're going to be thorough in the removal, but knowing the species can relate to causation. So something like Stachybotrys, for example, that species needs a long, sustained moisture source. So picking that up means that there's a different causation happening than the humidity amplified mold that we see that's typical of Aspergillus, Penicillium, Cladosporum.
Okay, we have time for one more question, but just as a reminder, the recording of this webinar, along with the slide presentation, will be uploaded to the ARAPA website, probably within the next week or so. So one more question. Is there any advantage to keeping lights on, off in vacant rooms to help prevent mold growth?
No, and I could see why that question is asked, but no, not necessarily.
Okay, well, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank Christine for taking time to do this presentation, and I want to thank all of the attendees for taking time out of their busy day to do the presentation. We will be back with another ARAPA webinar in, I believe, August, but look for our announcements. Again, Christine, thank you so much. Attendees, have a great day. Bye-bye now.
My pleasure. Thank you. Billy and Amy, are you still there?
Yes, I'm going to turn off the recording now. And unfortunately, it's not letting me turn it off.
Really?
Yes.